Rose Guatemala, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
We understand that President Trump is going to call Vladimir Putin as early as tomorrow. You've been in negotiations with senior Russian officials. What's it like?
Senior Russian officials, from the president on down, are zero-sum negotiators. They know the game very, very well. They're always looking for a winner-take-all kind of solution. And so, but you know, President Trump is pretty good at that game himself. So I think he's been clear with Vladimir Putin already that this cannot be a winner-take-all situation. He said both men, Zelensky and Putin, need to make concessions.
Does that mean that we will not see a peace on the table that includes Ukraine being permanently excluded from NATO?
I think that they have so far had a very interesting formulation. Pete Hegseth said in Brussels a couple weeks ago, membership in NATO is not a part of this war termination package. That is a very clever formulation, and I think they need to stick with it. What Putin would like is some kind of permanent exclusion from NATO, but I think as long as NATO is in the far distant future, that's fine, and it should stay that way.
So what are the minimum terms? What can the West, what can the US give to Putin, obviously that's acceptable to Zelensky, but
Right.
is acceptable to the West more generally?
Well, Zelensky from the outset said not a single Russian boot on a centimeter of Ukrainian territory. And he already seems to have backed off that now and made it clear that he's willing to talk about what a line of contact would be in a kind of ceasefire situation. And I think that that is what the United States will expect to see from Zelensky now. But then they have to ask Putin to back off his maximalist demand to have all of the 4 provinces in the eastern part of Ukraine, all of that territory, which is ridiculous. And Zelensky said that today. That's just ridiculous because that is Ukrainian land.
So you don't see President Trump or the administration pushing for those 4 provinces to be part of Russia, or even in a non-permanent fashion to be part of Russia?
That would be a no-go for the Ukrainians. They would walk away from the table.
Should a requirement for Russia to come back to negotiations on nuclear weapons also be embedded in this deal?
Well, I'd certainly like to see that as a nuclear negotiator, but I think that Trump and Putin have already signaled to each other that they're ready to come to the table again. Trump has been very keen to start negotiations with both Putin and Xi on reducing, and he says denuclearizing entirely. We'll see what that means. But Putin answered that by saying, yes, we could get back to the negotiating table again. And so it's not linked to the Ukraine negotiations per se, but I think that it will be part of the kind of the environment of the negotiations over Ukraine.
But if the Ukrainians don't get those 4 provinces and they don't get permanent exclusion from NATO, that feels like a loss or a back down from Putin. Is that conceivable?
Well, Trump has said, once again, Mr. Putin, you need to make concessions, and if you're not ready, I'm going to be ready to sanction you. And that message has been backed up by Trump officials, senior officials like the Commerce Secretary, saying, we can cause, they're about 3 level of pain now, we can cause the Russians 10 level of pain. I'm not sure how they're going to do that. The Biden administration was very good at sanctioning the Russians, but there can be more pressure applied to Moscow.
Now, obviously, people have been reeling from the disruption caused by the new president, but do you have some confidence that his team will be adept negotiators?
So far, he has shown with his team that they are very good at what they do. We've had Mr. Witkoff, for example, who's already been very important in trying to get this Gaza deal across the finish line, and he was just in Moscow last week. When I heard he had talked to Vladimir Putin for almost 4 hours, I said that was a serious negotiation. So, yes, I think he has some good people around him.
What does Vladimir Putin say in those 4 hours? We're not used to the idea of him in genuine talks with anyone.
Well, for one thing, it was very clever. He said, in principle, I accept the ceasefire deal at the end of the 4 hours. Whenever I hear a Russian negotiator saying, in principle, в принципе, I know that after that there are going to be some caveats, some conditions laid down. And sure enough, that's exactly what Putin did. But it does seem from the behind-the-scenes discussions and the commentary on them that they actually made a good deal of progress over this weekend. So we'll see what that means.
So let's assume, for the sake of this discussion, that some kind of a peace is achievable. That means a peacekeeping force, which Australia has said it would in some small way contribute to. How dangerous a mission would that be?
Well, it depends on how well the ceasefire is designed. And actually, Putin has a point there that a ceasefire needs to be well designed with implementation measures well worked out. The rules of the road need to be understood by all parties, including the force that is, I prefer to call it an implementation force rather than a peacekeeping force. So we'll see, again, some hard work has to be done to work out exactly the conditions. But if the conditions are well laid down and it's a predictable situation, then it should be sustainable.
Can you have a sustainable ceasefire without the crucial element of US air support?
Yes, it's air support, it's intelligence support, reconnaissance support. It's a number of different areas that the United States would provide enablers to the countries who would be in.
And of course, I beg your pardon, I ask that because Donald Trump has been ambiguous on the topic of whether America would supply air support.
Exactly. He has been crystal clear, no American boots on the ground, troops involved, but they've left open the question of what kind of backup they might be willing to provide. So I hope that it will still be possible. Otherwise, it will be incumbent on the European countries and the partners, perhaps Australia coming in to provide some of that capacity themselves.
How dangerous a peace would that be to keep? What if that turns into a hot war in Ukraine, a live firing situation?
We'll have to, I think, take that into very, very careful account. And of course, all the leaders involved in these discussions, Keir Starmer in the UK has been gathering those discussions in recent days, are very, very aware of this. And so, again, I think the basic conditions of the ceasefire will have to be well understood, and troops will have to be in a condition to be able to sustain and maintain that. But if it gets hot, then it'll have to be clear, they'll have to be pulled out.
Just to come to the bigger question, there's been a lot of commentary around the disruption, the same word again, around President Trump's change in strategy. Can NATO survive a Trump presidency?
Well, the big shock to NATO came in 2017 during his first term when I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. For the first time, he came to NATO headquarters, walked through the door and said, unless you all pay up, I'm not going to abide by the Article 5 commitments of collective security in the case of an attack, the defense guarantee, so to say. So the big shock came then, and the Allies are kind of used to it now, but they are paying more, not only on the back of Trump's threats, but because Putin invaded Ukraine for the second time in 2022. So now they have to figure out what happens if the United States continues to be not there at the NATO table in the same way it has been, the first among equals, constantly leading, and the questions raised about Trump's commitment to the alliance are very much weighing on the minds of NATO leaders. So, yeah, it's a different situation, but do I think NATO can survive? Yes, I do.
Thank you very much indeed for your expertise tonight, Rose Guatemala. Thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.